First, I'd like to recognize Art Speaks, which is the University of Chicago's Artist in Residence program. And in particular, I'd like to recognize Olivia Sebi, who's sitting right there, who's been responsible for helping us to make this program possible this afternoon. I'd also like to thank the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, and that's the building that we're in here today. And in particular, I'd like to thank Rodney Graham, who's probably out there in the hallway, who also was very important in helping us be able to put this program together today. And it's, I think, significant that we're here in the relatively new Office of Multicultural Student Affairs building, which is increasingly becoming an important space for students of color and their allies on campus, and the perfect location for this kind of program. Guillermo Gómez-Peña is a performance artist and writer and the director of the art collective La Pocha Nostra. He was born in Mexico City and came to the United States in 1978. Since then, he's been exploring cross-cultural issues with the use of performance, multilingual poetry, journalism, video, radio, and installation art. His performance work and eight books have contributed to debates on cultural diversity, identity, and U.S.-Mexico relations. His artwork has been presented at over 700 venues across the U.S., Canada, Latin America, Europe, Russia, and Australia. He's a MacArthur Fellow and an American Book Award winner and a regular contributor to National Public Radio, a writer for newspaper and magazines in the U.S., Mexico, and Europe, and a contributing editor to the Drama Review. For tonight's presentation, Guillermo Gómez-Peña is going to focus on talk to us a little bit about some important trends in the field of art history and performance studies. And in particular, its current preoccupation with the documentation of the histories of performance and performance art practice, which sounds like a great idea, that we should document what's been going on in performance art. But this process has been problematic for a couple of reasons. First reason is that there have been very few Chicano, Latino, Latina, Mexicano voices in the field, and secondly, that the artists themselves have often not been included in this process of documenting their own histories. So Guillermo Gómez-Peña has taken it upon himself to initiate and create his own autobiographical archive. He's using documentation as a form of political praxis. He's presenting a first voice interpretation and self-representation of his work and his own analysis of how it fits into the larger social and political context. Gómez-Peña is an artist documentarian, a speaking subject, talking back to, presenting challenges to, and in dialogue with art historians who sometimes would prefer a silent object of study. So we are privileged tonight to be presented with just a small portion of his archives, Multiple Journeys, the life and work of Gómez-Peña.
It is a pleasure to be here in the University of Chicago. And this performance chronology I am about to present is a conceptual artwork in progress and one of my most personal pieces. It includes information and projects that connect my life and family to my art, which I embed in a political and art historical context. The chronology was conceived, as my dear host expressed it so eloquently, as a kind of intervention into the historical discourses of performance art. And at the same time, as an invitation for Chicano Latino art historians to incorporate our multiple parallel histories in the discourse of contemporary art, and for performance artists to engage in similar genealogical projects. Prior to my birth, I wish to share two facts about my ancestors. Like so many Mexican families, they have been migrating to the US since the mid-1800s. And if you review my family photo album from the late 1800s to the present, They have always had a highly developed sense of theatricality and an unself-consciously Baroque aesthetic. I'm just following suit. 1955, born Guillermo Gómez-Peña in the Sanatorio Español of Mexico City on September 23rd at 11:10 p.m. My hairy face and bizarre intensity shocked my father. Since an early age, I had a very performative personality. My father was a gallant sportsman and civil engineer who devoted his life to bringing electricity to the Mexican countryside, putting food on our table, and playing high-a-lie. My mother was a fundraiser for social causes, hostess extraordinaire, and the irrefutable nerve center of the family. From 61 to 66, I studied elementary school, played guitar and football, soccer, traveling constantly to the Mexican countryside with my family. Who would ever imagine that this lovely Catholic kid would one day become the seditious exterminator? I invite you to come to this part of the room. There is still a few chairs. Please, let's wait for our colleagues. So from 1967 to 1972, next slide, please. Jesuits and Marista priests provide my secundaria and preparatoria education. I make surrealistic drawings that I hope never to publish. Here are two examples. Mexico is a fairly stable country, and the US a mythical place north of our imagination, a place to vacation, access modernity, and dream of a better future. In 1968, the Mexican student movement erupts like magma out of the Popocatépetl volcano. My older brothers and sisters' friends are part of it. Some end up in jail, others disappear for good. Tanks surround my neighborhood. The Tlatelolco student massacre takes place 5 minutes away from my home. In 1970, I write El Hombre de la Coladera, my first self-conscious performance about a young activist who becomes a misanthrope and chooses to live beneath the city inside the sewage system. The piece is presented in my Catholic high school with spoken word and slides, such as this one. After the performance, a priest sends me to the school psychiatrist. In 1971, the Normal de Maestros student massacre takes place a few blocks away from my home. I write and perform Smogman, a sci-fi piece describing one of my first performance personas, an activist superhero who fights against pollution in Mexico City. You can see me here lecturing a bunch of perplexed soldiers. The third act includes a museum of quote-unquote things past with purified water, plants, and taxidermied extinct animals. These ideas will resurface in my work years later. In 1974, I formed my first collective called Anarquía S.A. This is my proto-punk look at the time. We produce ritual happenings, bad atonal music, and practice, quote, ritual sex and drugs, unquote. Gurdjieff, Antonin Artaud, Nicanor Parra, the Chilean poet, Carlos Castaneda, they are our textbooks. I joined Swami Pranavananda's ashram in Tepoztlán. From 74 to 78, I studied philology and linguistics at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. The campus is an open laboratory of radical politics and student activism. We read about the Latin American literary boom. Let's go to the prior one. We read about the Latin American literary boom and liberation movements and discover the French symbolists and the beat poets. Everyday life feels like a Godard movie. I engage in a series of involuntary performance art pieces using the streets of Mexico City as a gallery without walls. I still don't have a name for what I do. My conceptual godfather is artist Felipe Ehrenberg in the photograph, blessed his tattooed heart, and my guru is Alejandro Jodorowsky. In 78, I received a scholarship to study at the California Institute of Arts, or CalArts. I crossed the US-Mexico border in search of artistic fresh air and my lost Chicano family. I suddenly become brown, a quote-unquote wetback, a beaner, a greaser. I do not know the implications of these words. I begin my process of Chicanoization with the unsolicited help of the Los Angeles police. I shot this photo outside of an INS detention center, perhaps my first site-specific performance. In the same year, I walked from Tijuana to CalArts in 2.5 days. My hair covered with gauze. I wear my father's suit and carry a briefcase containing my passport, talismans, and a diary. As I arrive at CalArts, a friend takes this picture. From 79 to 72, I am in CalArts. Here, my friend Leonidas and I dress identically as los dos Mr. Misterios for a week. I explore the Los Angeles performance art scene. I'm lucky. I hook up with Paul McCarthy, Chris Burdon, and the Chicano collective ASCO. 1979. I spent 24 hours in a public elevator wrapped in batik, fabric, and rope. A metaphor for painful birth in a new country, a new identity, the Chicano, and a new language, intercultural performance. It's my first performance formally documented by the art world. I spent 12 hours lying on the downtown Los Angeles streets as a Mexican's homeless person. Despite the fact that I am wrapped in a serape and surrounded by candles, most people ignore me. I discovered that as a Mexican and as a homeless person, I am literally invisible to the Anglo-Californian population. Performance is my strategy to become visible. Spanglish poetry reading in a public bathroom. For a whole day, I sit on a toilet and read aloud epic poetry describing my journey to the US. My audience is composed strictly of people who want to piss, shit, or wash their hands. Through these types of experiments, I become interested in the notion of performing for involuntary audiences. 1980, Mexiphobia. I begin to experiment with images of fear of the Mexican other. O sea, my friends and I start showing up at various public places, dressed as typical drug dealers, caricatured quote-unquote illegal aliens, stylized banditos, yet we behave in ways that contradict the stereotype. Once we show up at a restaurant dressed as typical Latino terrorists. The place empties out within 5 minutes of our arrival. I wonder what would happen if I were to recreate this performance nowadays. 1980, at CalArts, choreographer Sarah Jo Berman and I form an interdisciplinary arts troupe named Poiesis Genética. From the Spanish word pollo, a derogative derogatory term for migrant workers, and the Greek genesis. The members are newly arrived immigrant students from Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and Canada, bound by a shared sense of cultural displacement. Poiesis develops an artistic strategy of fusing various cultural traditions using performance as a syntactic thread. We mix indigenous rituals from various parts of the world with installation and video art, combining sexual and political imagery, personal pathos, or pathos, how do you say in English? Pathos, and pop culture. We perform in art spaces and theaters as well as in the streets, and use live animals such as piglets, parrots, and snakes on a stage. We experiment with altered states of consciousness induced by fasting, alcohol, or lack of sleep. Those were the days. Though extremely important in our development as artists, these performances are more interesting to us than to our poor audiences. In 1982, I graduated from CalArts and spent 6 months touring Europe with a few Poiesis members. It's our first tour ever. We begin performing in small theaters and artist lofts and end up working the streets. I lose my virginity as a performance artist. At the end of the tour, I am hypoglycemic, hungry, and weighing just 60 kilos. I write a book titled The Misadventures of Mr. Misterio and Salome, and the manuscript gets lost. The first Mexican financial crack occurs, and our family savings evaporate overnight. My father advises me not to return to Mexico, stay in Southern California, and wait for better times, he says. The wait turns out to be the rest of my life. I'm still waiting. In 1983, Poiesis Genetica relocates to the Tijuana-San Diego border region, where we find an ideal terrain to explore intercultural relations and become more overtly political. Sarah Jo and I reconstitute the troupe with local artists. We perform on both sides of the border as political praxis, making an average of $50 per performance, enough to buy props, tacos, and an occasional drink. One day, I receive a phone call in San Diego. My beloved cousin Alfonso, who grew up with me, has been murdered in Mexico City, stabbed 22 times. The murderer, a bodyguard of a pop celebrity, spends only 1 month in jail. If you're a daily binational commuter, the border is a dramatic place to live. I begin to publish the border arts magazine, The Broken Line. And in 1984, with visual, performance, and conceptual artists, we form the Border Arts Workshop, or BAUTAV, a binational arts collective involving Chicano, Mexican, and Anglo artists. Our objective is to explore US-Mexico relations and border issues using performance, installation art, video, and experimental poetry, as opposed to straight activism. We proclaim the border region a laboratory for social and aesthetic experimentation, and propose the artist as a social thinker and binational diplomat, and we use lots of humor. Similar activist groups are forming in other parts of the country, including the Guerrilla Girls, Group Material, Act Top, and the Los Angeles Poverty Department. Performance, political activism, and community concerns are completely intertwined in the spirit of the times. BAUTAV's strictly artistic activities help to protect our backs and legitimize our more activist work. In addition to art shows, publications, radio programs, town meetings, and films, we organize performances right on the borderline, where the US meets Mexico in the Pacific, literally performing for audiences in both countries. When the Border Patrol gets too close, we cross to the Mexican side. During certain performances, we invite our audiences to cross illegally to the other side. We exchange food and art illegally, caress and kiss illegally across the border fence, and confront the border patrol in costume. We are protected by, let's go for the next one. We are protected by the presence of journalist friends and video cameras. The political implications of the site and the symbolic weight of these actions garner immediate attention from the international media. These are the origins of the border arts movement. In 1985, I also begin the Velvet Hall of Fame, a long-term collaboration with traditional velvet tourist painters from Tijuana who reinterpret my performance characters. The process is very matter of fact. The more I pay, the better the painting is, period. They don't care about reviews or art openings, but they get a kick out of my madness. My conceptual velvet art project will last for a decade, during which I get to exhibit these paintings at the Walker Art Center, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the Corcoran Gallery. Some of these paintings become part of performance art projects with my colleague Roberto Cifuentes, who is here. And when I see these paintings hanging within a distance of a Gauguin or a David Salle, I somehow feel historically vindicated. I love to cross the border between high and low art. 1985, within 24 hours, 2 major earthquakes destroyed entire sections of Mexico City, killing more than 100,000 people. Most artists and intellectuals participate in the rescue efforts. My nephews, neighbors, and I form a humble brigade. We carry corpses from a police station to the morgue. The city will never be the same. I will never be the same. A powerful civic society and a new culture emerge out of the debris, including Superbarrio, Rock en Español, a new journalistic and radical cartoon movement. In 1986, I become interested in the interface between performance and photography. I work with artist theorist Emily Hicks on a series of performances titled Documented, Undocumented, playing on the double meaning of the terms vis-a-vis immigration status and as an art piece. The performances are staged for the camera and documented in photojournalistic style. So here, a generic Latin American general exiled in La Jolla performs for his inner ghosts and troubling memories. My interest in what I term photo performance will continue until the present day, and in fact, this PowerPoint is an expression of this interest. In 1987, my collaborators and I staged several performance pilgrimages in different border cities. In Tijuana, Niagara, Emily and I spent a month working along the US-Canadian border between Ontario and New York State, using Art Park as a base of operations. We travel in a mobile temple created from pseudo-indigenous souvenirs and religious kitsch purchased in both Tijuana and Niagara Falls. We carry out 15 performance actions, including the auctioning of border art, spiritual consultation for tourists, begging for money in costume, photo sessions with, quote, authentic border shamans and witches, unquote, and broadcasting bilingual poetry with a huge megaphone from one shore of the Niagara River to the other. That same year, several Tijuana performance artists and I gather at the municipal cemetery of Tijuana and attempt to cross the US-Mexico border checkpoint in costume and without documents. From 1987 to 1990, I attempt several times to cross the border in costume. I am rejected 3 times, and those rejected personas never find their way into my performances. In 1988, Emily and I staged our performance wedding right on the Tijuana-San Diego borderline, with poets and musicians performing on both sides, and family and friends crossing illegally into each other's countries during the ceremony. The media labels the event a, quote, masterpiece of symbolic politics, which probably saves me from deportation. Emily is 7 months pregnant, which doesn't make my mother very happy. My only son, Guillermo Emiliano, is born in San Diego, and a few months later, my beloved father dies in Mexico City. Both events accelerate my process of Chicanoization. I no longer can afford to think that one day I will return to Mexico. I wear my father's clothes for 1 year. I inherit my family's oldest house, which soon becomes Chicano Central in Mexico City, a gathering place and party then for Chilango and Chicano artists and writers. In 1988, the performance monologue movement is officially born. Many performance artists, including Tim Miller, Karen Finley, Spalding Gray, and myself, feel that performance has become so artificial and technically complex that we need to go back to the basics and recapture the power of the spoken word. The result is a low-tech, language-based type of performance that literally fits in a suitcase. This art movement provides us with incredible geographic mobility. We can travel with our entire production inside of a suitcase, as well as disciplinary mobility. At different times, we can present our work in the context of art, theater, literature, activism, radio, and film. The performance field expands to include spoken word poets, radical theorists, and weird stand-up comedians. We all share an interest in the transformative power of the live word and a desire to explore the flaming intersection of personal identity and social issues. My main contribution to the performance monologue movement is Border Brujo, a spoken word monologue dealing with border identity. The script is written in English, Spanish, Spanglish, Gringoñol, and various made-up Robo languages. My portable altar, which functions as set design, as well as my handmade costumes, are composed of pseudo-ethnic objects, tourist shachkas, and cheap religious souvenirs. With Border Brujo, I become a migrant performance artist, spending 2 years on the road, going from city to city, from country to country and back, reproducing the migratory patterns of the Mexican diaspora. As I travel, I incorporate new texts, props, and costumes into the piece. The Brujo and I end up back at the US-Mexico border in late '89, where I bury his costume and props and stage his performance funeral. I received both a New York Bessie Award and the Prix de la Parole from the International Theater Festival of the Americas. I am suddenly propelled into the center of the art world, and my personal life becomes extremely complicated. 1989, a group of artists, including Linda Burnham, Tim Miller, myself, we jumpstart Highway's performance space in Santa Monica. The Los Angeles art scene is imbued with a utopian spirit of collaboration and polyamorous hedonism. Glasnost and perestroika spread like wildfire throughout the Soviet bloc. The right perceives this phenomenon as the defeat of socialism. I want to see for myself. So I traveled to Russia with a binational human rights commission, performing my art as a form of radical diplomacy. In 1990, the US experiences yet another seasonal Latino boom, and border art becomes fashionable. The original Border Arts Workshop is invited to the Venice Biennial, after which we feel it's time to dismantle the group to avoid becoming a parody of ourselves, the Grateful Dead of border art. It's time for me to search for a new place from which to speak. I begin a series of collaborations with writer and artist Coco Fusco, the first a multimedia installation titled Norte Sur. In 1991, I moved to New York to live with Coco and to work on the first part of my trilogy, The Rediscovery of America by the Warrior for Gringos Troika, at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. One day, during rehearsal, I get the magical phone call announcing that I'm a quote-unquote MacArthur genius. I don't know what that is. My ex-wife sues me, taking half of my fellowship in court, and some of the original members of the Border Arts Workshop suggest that I split the other half amongst the group. I ask myself, is this the true birth, my true birth ritual into the American art world? 92, artists such as James Luna, Fred Wilson, Adrian Piper, and Jimmy Durham begin to interrogate the way museums represent cultural otherness and start a dialogue with radical anthropologists. I begin to experiment with the colonial format of the living diorama. My collaborators and I create interactive living museums that parody various colonial practices of representation, including the ethnographic tableau vivant, the Indian trading post, the border curious shop, the porn window display, and their contemporary equivalents. These performances function both as a bizarre set design for a contemporary enactment of cultural pathologies and as a ceremonial space for people to reflect upon their attitudes toward other cultures. Here I am performing as a quote-unquote designer shaman in a Toronto mall. In 92, 93, during the heated debate surrounding the Columbus Quincentenary, Coco and I decide to remind the US and Europe of the other history of intercultural performance, the sinister human exhibits, and pseudo-ethnographic spectacles that were so popular in Europe from the 17th century until the early 20th century, and that at the turn of the century in the US, they transformed into more vulgar versions, like the Dime Museum and the Freak Show. In the Watinawi World Tour, Coco and I live for 3-day periods inside a gilded cage as, quote, undiscovered Amerindians from the fictional island of Watinawi, Anglicization of What Now, in the Gulf of Mexico. I am dressed as an Aztec wrestler from Las Vegas, and Coco as a Taína straight out of Gilligan's Island. We're hand-fed by fake museum docents and taken to public bathrooms on leashes. Taxonomic plates describing our costumes and physical characteristics are placed next to the cage. We tour the US, Europe, Australia, and Argentina, and sadly, over 40% of our audiences believe the exhibit is real, yet do nothing about it. The most drastic audience response is from an Argentine military man who throws acid on me during the performance in Buenos Aires. The tour is chronicled in the film Couple in the Cage. Around the same time, Coco, Roberto Cifuentes, and I tour New World Border, a sci-fi piece based on the following metafiction. Border culture and hybrid identities become official culture as Anglo-Americans become a minority. We begin to practice reverse segregation of our audiences as they enter the art space with members of quote-unquote minorities, immigrants, and bilingual audience members entering the space first. The idea is to assume a fictional center and force monolingual, monocultural Americans to feel like minorities in their own country. Coco abandons the project in the middle of the tour, and Roberto replaces her. To continue the tour, we are forced to reconstitute the entire performance in less than a week. It somehow works. Roberto remains as my main collaborator until this day. In '93, Roberto and I become interested in Spanglish pirate radio and low-tech, high-tech art. We staged our first pirate radio project in a performance festival in Hull, in the UK. Also in '93, the backlash era begins and multiculturalism gets a bad rap. I moved back to LA and reconnect with the highways performance scene. The Los Angeles earthquake transforms the city into a compassionate place for a few months. I start a long-term collaboration with Native American artist James Luna. In the Shame Man Meets El Mexican at the Smithsonian Hotel and Golf Club, Luna and I share a diorama space at the Museum of Natural History. I sit on a toilet dressed as a mariachi in a straitjacket with a sign around my neck announcing there used to be a Mexican inside this body. I unsuccessfully attempt to get rid of my straitjacket while James paces back and forth. At times he is an Indian shoe shiner. Then he becomes a diabetic Indian, shooting insulin directly into his stomach. Later on, he transforms into a janitor and vacuums the diorama floor. Hundreds of visitors gather in front of us. They are sad and perplexed. Next to walls, the real Indian dioramas speak of a mute world outside of history and social crisis. While rehearsing the second part of our project, James lights up some sage. The security guards phone the DC police and we get busted in the dressing room for smoking pot. Furious with such a ludicrous claim, curator Alita Ringlero calls museum administration demanding an apology on our behalf. For James and me, such a situation is just a good anecdote. As James put it, simply one more day in the life of an Indian and a Chicano. We reenact the bust in a series of photos, which are now in the Smithsonian archives. That's so bizarre. 1994, NAFTA comes into effect. The Zapatista insurrection takes the world by surprise. Unorganized crime makes its home in Mexico City. To fight my fear of losing the streets to crime, my colleagues and I engage in a series of street performances in downtown Mexico City. Here I am, an unemployed performance artist asking for a job. Grandma Carmen, the moral center of my family, dies in Mexico City. My relatives and I surround Grandma's bed as her soul leaves her body. In 1994, Roberto Cifuentes and I crucify ourselves for 3 hours on 16-foot high crosses at Rodeo Beach in front of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge. The piece is designed to protest the xenophobic immigration politics of California Governor Pete Wilson. Inspired by the biblical myth of Demas and Gestas, the two petty thieves crucified alongside Jesus, Roberto and I decide to dress as, quote, the two contemporary public enemies of California, unquote. I am here as the undocumented bandido crucified by the INS, and Roberto as the generic gang member crucified by the Los Angeles Police Department. Using a flyer, we ask our audience to free us from our martyrdom as a gesture of political commitment, but we miscalculate. Paralyzed by the melancholy of the image, it takes audience members over 3 hours to figure out how to get us down without a ladder. By then, my right shoulder has become dislocated and Roberto has passed out. Fortunately, the media picks up photographs of the crucifixion project and the piece becomes international news. 94, Grey Wolf Press publishes my first book, Warrior for Gringos Troika. It's my border art period. In the same year, Roberto and I create the interactive pirate television project Naftastic TV. This simulacrum of a pirate TV intervention is broadcast to hundreds of cable television stations across the country, as well as over computer networks via early broadband technology. The content is a strange blend of radical politics, autobiographical material, and a parody of traditional TV formats gone bananas. We demonstrate an alleged Chicano virtual reality machine that can turn collective and personal memories into video footage. An edited version of the project is rebroadcast nationally in '95 and becomes a cult hit. In '94, my colleagues and I begin to take our personas out of the museum or theater and into the streets, often crashing politically charged sites in costume. This practice continues into the present. Our idea is as follows. If our personas survive the tough, involuntary audiences of the street, they will definitely survive the harshness of the art world. Here, Roberto and I are kneeling in front of a Van Gogh painting at the Dia Museum in Detroit. And here, the Pocha crew is crashing the Met. In this photo, Roberto, Spanish filmmaker Pilar Cano, and I are about to crash Ellis Island in costume. 94 to 96, Roberto and I tour Temple of Confessions, a performance installation combining the format of the ethnographic diorama with that of the religious dioramas found in colonial Mexican churches. For 3-day periods, we exhibit ourselves inside plexiglass boxes as end-of-the-century saints. Those visitors who wish to confess their intercultural fears and desires to the saints, they have 3 options. They can either confess into microphones placed on kneelers in front of the plexi boxes, or if they are shy, they can write their confessions on a card and deposit them in an urn. And if they are extremely shy, they can call an 800 number. The confessions are quite emotional and intimate. They range from confessions of extreme violence and racism toward Mexicans and other people of color, quote unquote, to expressions of incommensurable tenderness and solidarity with us or with our perceived cause. Some confessions are filled with guilt or fear of cultural, political, sexual invasion, violence, rape, and disease. Other confessions are fantasies about escaping one's identity, Anglos wanting to be Mexican or Indian, or vice versa, self-hating Latinos wanting to be Anglo or simply blonde. By the end of the 3rd day, we leave the plexiglass boxes and are replaced by human-sized wax effigies. The project is documented in a PBS film documentary. The last performance of the tour takes place at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. 1995, I moved to San Francisco, attracted by its radical mythology. and begin the long-term project of tattooing my torso and arms. Nola Mariano, Roberto Cifuentes, and I found La Pocha Nostra. The objective is to create a loose interdisciplinary association of rebel artists interested in collaboration. Inspired by Zapatismo, our collaborative model of concentric and overlapping circles functions both as an act of civic diplomacy and as a means to create ephemeral communities of like-minded rebels. We are more of a conceptual laboratory than a company, and a strategic gathering of politicized artists thinking together, exchanging ideas. We strongly believe in collaboration across race, gender, generations, and nationality as a form of citizen diplomacy. We begin a binational exchange project with Mexican performance artists titled Terreno Peligroso, or Danger Zone. It's a good time for Mexican and Chicano artists to work together. It's 1995, and we create a free art agreement, an ongoing exchange of ideas and artwork, and begin to collaborate across the border. Also that year, I begin my long-term association with the National Public Radio program, All Things Considered. I record a monthly commentary from the position of a performance artist, and I suddenly have a national voice in a society in which mainstream media only covers artists as either celebrities, human interest stories, or social monsters, but rarely as critical intellectuals. In '95, Roberto and I begin to tour Borderama, a performance that subverts and parodies pop cultural formats such as the talk show, the self-realization seminar, a hypnotist lounge act, a French anthropologist lecture, and an ethnic fashion show. In the press release, we invite the audience to, quote, come to the show in costume, dressed as your favorite cultural other, and express those interracial fantasies we all have inside of us. We invite special guests from the local communities to participate in the show, including street performers, drag queens, Mexican wrestlers, small-town eccentrics. And at the end of the piece, Roberto and I auction ourselves as sexy, AIDS-free, third world performance artists. It was a real auction, and I won't tell you what happened afterwards. In '96, Roberto and I visit the Zapatista area. We travel through various military checkpoints, posing as eco-tourists. It was a Luis Valdez forgives my aesthetic sins. '96, City Lights publishes my next book, New World Border, in which I develop my thesis of hybridity and my critique of global culture. I become interested in the politics of new technologies. This billboard announces a project of ours in Dallas. I write extensively about racism in the internet and develop the concept of poetic, or rather useless, technologies, meaning technologies which are with strictly aesthetic or ritual purposes. My colleagues and I begin to construct Chicano cyborgs with lowrider prosthetics and braces. The basic idea is, if we don't have access to this technology, we have to imagine it. '97, the art world begins to talk about relational aesthetics. Roberto, radical choreographer Sarah Shelton Mann, and I, we jumpstart a 3-year project titled The Exterminator. The idea is to use the internet as a tool of reverse anthropology to research America's psyche regarding Anglo-Latino relations. Then to develop an ever-evolving repertoire of performance persona based on this research. We develop confessional websites, asking individuals to suggest how we should dress as Mexicans and Chicanos, what kind of performance actions and social rituals we should engage in. The internet confessions are much more explicit than those gathered during live performances such as the Temple of Confessions. Scholars help us select the most striking and representative confessions so we can use them as source material for performance. As performance artists, we embody this information and reinterpret it for a live audience, thus refracting fetishized constructs of identity through the spectacle of our artificially constructed identities on display. A gorgeous photo portfolio by photographer Eugenio Castro is made out of the Exterminator persona, and that's what you've been watching, the last 5 images. 97, up to the present, Chicana writer Sandra Cisneros invites the Latino MacArthur Fellows to form the, quote, Macarturos, unquote, or Macabrones. Part ombudsmen and part cultural instigators, the group meets once a year in a different US city with a sizable Latino community in turmoil. These gatherings are designed as informal think tanks and as a means to insert a Latino perspective into national debates. We strategically use our name to empower local communities, generate public dialogue, and confront local authorities. Besides Sandra, Paul Roldan, who lives here in Chicago, and myself, participants include Latino activists, lawyers, artists, academics. In 1998, I teamed with producer Michael Milensky to create a Chicanoized version of The Indian Queen, a 17th century opera by composer Henry Purcell and poet John Dryden. It's a very racist opera. I rewrite the original script in Spanglish. In our version, the Indian Queen is a fallen Hollywood starlet, and her throne is a lowrider car shaped as a red stiletto. In 1998, La Pocha Tour's Borderscape 2000, described by critics as a high-tech Aztec Spanglish lounge operetta. The performance critiques the corporate appropriation of multiculturalism. One image lingers in my mind: a stylized gang member clubbing a chicken to the tune of Hotel California. We cross the PC border. The performance is heavily criticized by theorists for contributing to the fetishization of extreme Latino imagery. It is clear to La Pocha that we have reached a dead end and that what we need is to open a new door. We become obsessed with trying to understand extreme pop culture. What 10 years ago was considered fringe subculture is now mere pop. Why? The insatiable mass of the so-called mainstream has finally devoured all margins, and the more dangerous, thorny, and exotic these margins, the better. In fact, stricto sensu, we can say there are no margins left. Alternative thought and so-called radical behavior, as we knew them, have actually become the mainstream. Stylized racism and sexism are now daily spectacle. This poses all kinds of questions for us. If we choose to mimic or parody the strategies of the mainstream bizarre in order to develop new audiences and explore the zeitgeist of our times, what certainty do we have that our high-definition reflection won't devour us from inside out and turn us into the very stylized freaks we are attempting to deconstruct or parody? In 1998, we gradually, and as a response to this research, we gradually begin to surrender our will to the audience, allowing them to shape the content of our work by manipulating us in tableau and joining us in performing composite identities dictated by the fears and desires of the museum visitors. El Exterminator project, which has been already on tour for 3 years, becomes even more participatory, encouraging audience members to interact with us in various modes. They can touch us, smell us, hand feed us, braid our hair. They can spray paint our bodies, point fake weapons at us, change our makeup, put different wigs and headdresses on us, using the performers as life-size paper dolls. They put dog leashes on us, engaging in consensual power games. Some people decide to get rough while holding the leash, especially the most conservative-looking ones. Wherever we go, we invite local artists, curators, intellectuals, and activists to stage their own dioramas within the larger piece. 99, I marry gorgeous Colombian curator and writer Carolina Ponce de Leon. And our house in San Francisco becomes an informal roadside museum, salon, and hostel for Mexican, Colombian, US, and European artists who pass through. A local TV station does a reportage on the house, calling it, quote, the Smithsonian of the barrio. 99, filmmaker Gustavo Vázquez and I create The Great Mojado Invasion, a mock documentary that presents an ironic 21st century reversal of US-Mexico relations as, quote, dastardly mustachioed bandidos reconquer the United States and impose their own language and culture upon Anglo-Americans, unquote. 99, there is major turmoil, internal turmoil in the troupe. Roberto and Sara step out for personal reasons, while Juan Ibarra and Michelle Ceballos join on a more permanent basis. All projects must be reconfigured overnight. Here I am in Alaska on my first tour with Juanito and poetry slam queen Silvana Stroh. The new Pocha Nostra troupe tours the Living Museum of Fetishized Identities. The next step in our performance research is to develop large-scale interactive performance installations that function as intelligent raves and art expos of Western apocalypse. Every living museum is site-specific and involves a different group of local artists. Live music, video, computer projections, cinematic lighting, taxidermied animals, twisted ethnographic motifs, they all help enhance our high-tech Robo-Baroque aesthetic. In these intoxicating environments, we exhibit ourselves on platforms as intricately decorated ethno-cyborgs and quote-unquote artificial savages for 3 to 5 hours. The structure is open and non-coercive, allowing the audience to walk around the dioramas, designing their own journey. They can stay for as long as they wish, come in and out of the space, or return later, fully participating in our performance games, or keeping to the sidelines as voyeurs. In the first hour, the experience is typically voyeuristic. The ethno-cyborgs create slow-motion tableau bands that sample and combine radical political imagery, religious iconography, extreme pop culture, and theatricalized sexuality. The audience members are confronted with a stylized anthropomorphization of their own post-colonial hallucinations, a kind of cross-cultural poltergeist in which the space between self and other, us and them, fear and desire becomes blurry and unspecific. Sounds heavy, I know, but it's actually a lot of fun. As the evening evolves, the experience becomes increasingly more participatory. We include a diorama station where audience members can choose a temporary ethnic identity and become their favorite cultural other using makeup and costumes provided by us, after which they are encouraged to integrate themselves into our living dioramas. Both audience members and performers make political, ethical, and aesthetic decisions on the spot. And in this sense, the performance becomes an exercise in radical democracy. In the last hour, the artists, we step out of the dioramas and cede total control to the audience as the post-colonial demons dance all around us. 2000, while touring Brazil, I catch a mysterious parasite and experience a liver crash. My recovery takes 8 months. The doctors forbid me to perform and rehearse. During this time, I write Califas 2000, one of my darkest and most personal performance scripts ever. And also during my recovery, my new book comes out, Dangerous Border Crossers, The Artist Talks Back. In 2001, I begin touring my new solo performance titled Brownout. The script intertwines 2 discourses. One is a poetic political account of my times, and a parallel, more personal discourse recounts my inner hell during the recovery from my liver crash. 2001, the US experiences on its own soil its worst terrorist attack ever. The neocons in power rapidly transformed the country into a closed society ruled by paranoid nationalism and fear. An unprecedented era of censorship for artists and intellectuals begins. This climate forces La Pocha Nostra to spend more than half of the year outside the country, becoming Chicano expatriates abroad. Here we are on the cover of a Norwegian art magazine. 2002, in response to the challenges of 9/11, our work becomes much more bold and explicit, and we create Regroup, a San Francisco-based performance laboratory dedicated to reconquer the artistic freedoms being taken away by the Bush administration. And I published my first book entirely in Spanish titled El Exterminador, la antropología inversa de un performero post-mexicano. At the same time, and as a response to the times, La Pocha begins to incorporate workshops as part of every project we do. It's like we become a nomadic performance workshop. La Pocha resumes the exploration of ceding our will to the audience begun in the Exterminator project with a new performance titled Ex Centris, in which we completely reverse the gaze and step out of our dioramas. We create tableau bands with audience members, manipulating their body positions, decorating them with costumes and props. We then invite them to create their own imagery. We call these experiments performance karaoke. It's our response to the extreme culture of mindless audience participation and role-playing created by talk shows and reality TV. In 2003, La Pocha Nostra performs Eccentrics at Tate Modern in London, a humongous coup for us. And a few months later, the troupe is confronted with harsh reality again, as Juan Ibarra steps out due to serious health issues, and Michelle Ceballos' father is kidnapped in Colombia. Roberto Cifuentes returns. Violeta Luna, a radical performance actress and a physical theater actress from Mexico City, becomes a full-time collaborator, and a Japanese American named Emiko Lewis joins in. All our upcoming presenters are perplexed by these abrupt changes. It takes half a year for La Pocha to settle into the new troupe. In 2004, we become interested in the search for a radical spirituality that can emerge from living against the backdrop of war. Emiko and I begin workshopping Mapa Corpo as a response to the invasion of Iraq. The performance installation is a poetic, interactive ritual that explores neo-colonization, decolonization through political acupuncture, and the reenactment of the post-9/11 body politique. It's clearly an anti-war performance, and for the first 2 years, we're only able to present it in Latin America, Europe, and Canada. Only after mid-2005 do US presenters dare to book it. Also in 2004, Michelle Ceballos' passport gets confiscated as we are trying to catch a plane for Buenos Aires. It will take 4 years for Michelle to recuperate it. At the same time, I begin a long-term project with the Spanish curator Orlando Brito Ginorio, a series of photo performance portfolios created specifically for the camera. The initial portfolios are shot in Mexico City, San Francisco, Madrid, and the Canary Islands. It is the first time in my life that I make art objects strictly for the gallery. My hope is that they function as a prosthetic extension of live performance. In 2005, as I approached my 50th birthday, my then 83-year-old mother and I collaborate in a performance ritual to prepare me for the second part of my life. She tenderly washes my body in an old-fashioned bathtub, then dries me with a towel and dresses me up with my father's clothes. The site is the garden of her Mexico City home. The audience is composed of 40 relatives and neighbors who were alive and around during my birthday, including my nanny and my first friends ever. In 2005 as well, Routledge publishes my new book, Ethno-Techno, Writings in Performance, Activism, and Pedagogy, and this is the cover photo. In 2005, we begin to conduct a yearly Pocha Nostra Summer School of Radical Performance Art in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. Artists come from all over the world to collaborate with indigenous Oaxacans working in experimental art forms. We offer 2 7-day intensive workshops on the human body as a site for creation, reinvention, memory, and activism. The first workshop is for young artists and the second for established artists, culminating in a public performance at the Museum of Contemporary Art of Oaxaca. The Pocha Summer School becomes an amazing artistic and anthropological experiment in how artists from 3 generations and many countries, from every imaginable artistic, ethnic, and subcultural background, begin to negotiate a common ground. Performance becomes the connective tissue and lingua franca for our temporary local/international community of rebel artists. Also in 2005, Violeta Luna, Roberto Cifuentes, curator Gabriela Salgado, and I begin to workshop and tour Mapa Corpo 2, interactive rituals for the new millennium. In this new version of Mapa Corpo, Violeta's nude body lies on a surgical table covered by the flag of the United Nations. Above the body, an acupuncturist dressed in a lab coat prepares for surgery, laying out 40 needles. A small flag is attached to the tip of each needle, each representing a nation of the so-called coalition forces. As I deliver a multilingual poem, dressed in my shaman transvestite persona, the acupuncturist peels the UN flag from Violetta's body, working from the feet up and exposing her. The acupuncturist then methodically inserts the 40 needles into the body map, leaving the audience to ponder the after image of a colonized female body world. I ask the audience to, quote, decolonize the mapa corpo, unquote, by carefully removing the flags with the assistance of the acupuncturist. One by one, each flag is lifted, completing the ritual. And parallel to this, at the second station, Gabriela ritually shapes and washes the body of Roberto as if preparing it for burial. It is the brown body of the universal immigrant. As the ritualized washing ends, Roberto's exposed skin becomes a canvas for the audience to write upon his body a poetics of hope. Those who accept the invitation also create tableau vivants with his body, bringing tenderness and humanity to an objectified image. Different versions of Mapa Corpo 2 are performed in 15 different countries. The piece becomes our main contribution to the performance field since the Exterminator. Also in 2006, I premiere a new solo performance titled The Exorcist, which I just presented a couple of days ago here in Chicago. So I won't talk about it. Let's go to the next one. And in the same year, my Chihuahua son, Babalu, is born in Northern California, and he will soon become a troublemaker in YouTube. In 2007, I complete the first part of my tattoo project, my autobiographical tattoo project. My torso and arms are all connected in a sort of total skin mural. And just to finish this section of my archives, because they go on forever, I just want to mention briefly this last project, which also happened in 2007, where I worked as an image consultant and performance advisor for the campaign of Chrissy Kiefer, a San Francisco activist lesbian dancer who ran for Congress under the Green Party ticket. My job was to produce provocative photo portfolios for the media, such as this one, and to suggest performative strategies for her campaign. The Green Party campaign officers were totally weirded out by my suggestions. But anyway, I think that we should probably stop here and maybe have a conversation. And thank you for your patience and your willingness to listen to my madness.